much for joining us for our webinar focused on media training basics to nail your next media interview. I am super excited that we're putting this webinar on. We have about half an hour of content, and then we're going to have some time at the end for Q&A for whoever wants to stay on. I did want to note that this is a great overview. And then, for a lot of our clients, we would take this content, but then spend a lot of time tailoring it and doing some individual training based on some of these tips and tricks we're going to share with you guys today. So I am April Mason, president and founder of Violet PR. I've spent the last almost 30 years doing media relations for economic development and real estate companies and related fields. I've probably sat in on, well, certainly dozens, but probably hundreds of media interviews for clients. And so I've seen some of the best situations, and I've also seen some really challenging situations happen. And so a goal of ours today is really to help everyone understand how to have a successful interview for you or your spokesperson and for your CEO.
And I'm Amanda Ferraro, a senior account manager at Violet PR. Just some quick background. I have more than 15 years of PR experience working with companies of all sizes, primarily with real estate and economic development. And for all of my accounts, media relations and strategy has always been a big part of what I do. And as part of that, I want to make sure that our clients always feel as comfortable as possible going into a lot of the interviews that we're setting up for them. So media training has been a baby of mine over the past several years, which I've really loved leading for a lot of our clients.
Yes. And so today I just wanted to share our quick session outline. So we're first going to start with the basics and talk about the kinds of journalists, the kinds of outlets and formats. And certainly before you do any media interview, you want to understand who you're talking to and what their outlet is all about, because each interview is going to be a little bit different based on what they need. We're also going to talk about how to set ground rules in advance of the interview and what those mean on background, off the record, on the record. We're going to talk to you about what to do to prepare for an interview in advance, and then what to do during the interview when you have some tough questions. And we're going to show you some examples as well. So types of media outlets. This is probably going to seem fairly obvious to those of you that work in media relations or marketing on a day-to-day basis. But a couple of important things to point out here. Many, I would say probably most of the journalists that we work with on a day-to-day basis are writing for news websites. It's certainly transitioned from the days of print being king in the late 90s, early 2000s, and almost every reporter is writing for their website. And then if it makes print later, it makes print later. But websites allow you to break news instantaneously. They allow for very lengthy pieces of content, and they're also very, very focused on getting clicks and views, which means they're going to be more interested in visuals and catchy headlines that will encourage sharing of their stories. For TV, if you're preparing for a television interview, your appearance obviously matters in a significant way, much more so than in an online or audio interview. And we have specific trainings we do with a video camera to teach CEOs and executives how to present for television. Also, you want to really speak in short sound bites for television. Audio is something that's taped remotely. You can do it from home or from your laptop, which is nice. I wanted to touch upon podcasts because they are an exploding format. Many of us saw with the recent election, both candidates used podcasts as a way to get their message out to audiences that might not follow the news on a day-to-day basis. But if you're doing a podcast, you have to prepare differently as well, because it could be a 45-minute conversation, not just 5 minutes or 10 minutes in an online or television story. So it's very important to prepare for that type of environment. And then print obviously still exists, although keeps shrinking. It's very important if you're working with a magazine to understand that they have really long lead times. So they may be talking to you in the summer for a piece that's going to run in the fall or the winter. And they also have space restrictions.
I can jump in on the next slide. So in addition to being really mindful about the types of outlets that you're dealing with, it's also good to think about the different type of news article category. Oh, sorry, I skipped ahead. The different types of journalists you'll encounter as well. So in general business, you're looking at your local business reporter. It could actually be business reporter at top tier outlets as well. They're most interested in those larger trends and the kind of the bigger picture angles. For mainstream and lifestyle reporters, they're much more focused on the human interest angles and the greater impact to the larger community. With influencers and bloggers, we're working with those definitely more frequently, but it's important to note that they're not guided by the same principles or editorial standards that a typical journalist would follow. They don't have editors or any oversight. They really work independently. And a lot of times they also have day jobs. So it's kind of a juggle to get in front of them for some opportunities. And then freelancers and contributors are also, I think, even more common today. We even see these a lot with top tier publications like Forbes and Fast Company. With these types of contacts, it's important to know that they might be covering a bunch of different topic areas for different publications. So their industry knowledge can vary. You might actually have to educate them a bit more than you would have to a typical reporter. Lastly, with trade press, these reporters are kind of going all in on that industry because that's what they're covering day in and day out. So that's kind of their world. You don't need to educate them as much, and you could have more of an in-depth conversation with them. And in those cases, they might actually ask more pointed questions as well. So it's good to keep in mind that it might be a different conversation that you'll have with a trade reporter as opposed to a freelancer or a general business reporter. Also wanted to touch on some of the news article categories when we're thinking about the outcomes and the results as a result of these interviews that you're having. And again, it's always good to think about the opportunity and the outcome going into the opportunity. So with hard news, you'll want to lead with something timely, something event-driven. These are often something that is based on a press release that can be put out by your PR firm. And these are kind of what the bread and butter of kind of what reporters are looking for. That being said, we don't always have hard news. So we also go out with some evergreen topics or evergreen articles. Those can essentially run at any time, and it would not make a difference if it runs this month as opposed to early next year. It's really like trends-based features, roundups that can be adapted at any point in time, essentially. There's also another great mode is profile pieces, which can focus on a company or an executive. And these can often be timely news, but I think what's nice about these is you're able to get to know more about the people behind the company through these. And lastly, we're finding these are more and more popular, especially with reporters being very busy. A lot of times they're looking for Q&As, and these can either be transcribed from a phone interview, or they could be, the reporter will give us questions and we provide emailed responses. So it's actually a very straightforward mode of coverage because you have a lot of control over what's running, but it's also easy for the reporter as well. So it's a nice format as well.
Yeah, and we wanted to share some examples of the types of news coverage. Here's a great example from a North Carolina announcement that we pitched last fall when Toyota was investing another $8 billion in their facility. These are probably the most straightforward types of news opportunities. And when we set up interviews here for Chris Chung, who heads the EDP&C, the Economic Development Group in North Carolina, he was prepped to specifically answer questions about why Toyota invested in North Carolina.
An example of an evergreen article, this was a Forbes.com piece about very trends focused about Newark's emergence as a live, work, play destination at a time when many tech startups and companies were flocking to the city. This did tie to some of the recent news and recent announcements that were coming out, but was definitely more of a broader trend-based article that could have been queued up at really any time. So this was another nice one where we were able to work with the reporter to queue it up and give him the most recent information, but very evergreen article.
And then next is a profile of one of our clients, Christina Casotis, who heads the Pittsburgh International Airport. There have been a lot of profiles on Christina, and part of the reason is it's unusual to have a female leading an airport. And so we've leaned into that, and she's been very open to that, doing interviews about her trajectory as a woman in the transportation industry, and then her vision for the airport. And then finally, this example is a Q&A that we placed last week. We have been, as I think Amanda said, getting a lot of requests for Q&As in publications as significant as CFO Magazine and other industry publications. And I think it's simply that it's a little bit easier for reporters and editors to run with these types of articles. All it involves is asking 7 or 8 questions, getting the responses, and putting up the article. So I think these are great, easy wins for us and for our clients and for you all as well. So the next phase of this presentation is talking about ground rules. So before you go into an interview, what do you do? And I want to emphasize, anytime you're speaking with a reporter, if it's a formal interview that someone set up for you, your PR firm, or if it's a phone call that you receive from a reporter, you must assume that the interview is on the record. What does on the record mean? It is anything you say can be quoted and attributed to you. So you must be very, very careful and prepared in these situations. I always advise, if you do run into a reporter on the street or at a restaurant, or they call you on the phone, which does happen in local markets all the time, don't necessarily feel like you have to answer their questions. In fact, I wouldn't answer their questions immediately. I would find out what they're looking for, what their deadline is, and schedule a time to talk to them so you can prepare with your team. There are off-the-record opportunities. I always advise that you leave those discussions and negotiations to the professionals. There may be a reason why you may want to talk to a reporter off the record to preserve the relationship, for example, but I would leave those negotiations, as I said, to the experts. It's too easy for it to get a little muddled and confusing. I've had clients in interviews say, oh, by the way, this part is off the record. And then they want to go back to on the record, and it can get muddled, and you risk getting quoted saying something that you don't want to say.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think like an anecdote that I could share from like a past experience was I had a client in a desk side where it was on the record, but then he decided to go off the record on a portion of it, and then they were back on the record, and it was actually confusing to the reporter, and they did end up using some of the off the record information in an article like following that meeting, which was problematic for the client. So I think in those cases, like April said, you always want to leave the off the record negotiation to your PR team. And I think it's just better for everyone if you're not going back and forth between the two, because it could be confusing. It could be confusing to the reporter, and you can have mistakes like that happen where they use something that you're really not wanting out there, which is not a good thing.
Yeah. And then obviously reporters are going to constantly be trying to get you to say something interesting. So when they ask you questions like, oh, just, between you and me, what do you think about this person? What was he like? Oh, I heard you know a lot about this topic. Be very careful, because there are savvy reporters out there that use their charm to get you to say things that will make their story a lot more interesting.
I think in addition to off the record, on the record, it's also important to know what on background means. So this is when the information is shared with the reporter with the condition that they are not able to quote you or name your company in their article. We see this a lot in, all different news articles where you see like a source shared or a source close to the deal shared with us. And I think it can be used effectively in a couple different situations. So if you're trying to build a relationship with the reporter and you want to be a resource to them, but you really don't want your name attached to the story, it could be used strategically in that way. I've also seen it a lot in the real estate industry. So if there's a large or high profile deal that closes, and you want to get the news out very quickly, but there's a lot of red tape and you're maybe not supposed to share certain information. I've seen brokers or others that are close to the deal kind of like leak the information strategically to a reporter. You see this a lot in real estate trades like Commercial Observer, The Real Deal, where they have the quotes there where it says a source close to the deal shared, and they have basically the full information. They're just not saying who they got it from. That means there was an on background conversation. I can
Much
also
to the chagrin, I'm sure, of the economic development team, who I'm sure wanted to keep it quiet until they could publicly make the news available. But it certainly does happen.
I could also show you
Um,
guys an example of that in the real estate world. That was a trade piece in Commercial Observer. So this was something that was recently covered, and then they basically tied it back to an anonymous source, essentially. So there was a non-background conversation with that reporter.
Yeah, there was another situation I learned about just last week. There was a controversial data center project that was being considered by a community in the Midwest. And the engineering firm that was involved in the project spent, he told me, an hour and a half with a New York Times reporter on background. But did not end up being quoted in the story and did not want to be quoted in the story because the project was confidential. But they did the on background conversation to build and preserve the relationship with the reporter. So sometimes that is a reason to do it if you don't necessarily want the news out there, but it's going to come out anyway. You can ensure that at least the reporter has accurate information and that they don't quote you.
I do want to add too with on background, off the record, and on the record. It's always good to make sure, just to reiterate, that your PR team is handling the negotiation of that. And we always make sure we get the agreement in writing. So it's not like something that they're just telling us on the phone. Like we have, a written response from that reporter that they're abiding by that. So there's always like a process to go through, but it's always good to work with a PR team on that.
Yeah, and get it in writing, absolutely. Too easy for that to get confused and muddled. So the next section of our presentation is really talking about how to prepare for these interviews. And I always advise, you want to make a note of the three main things that you would like to see in the story and make sure your quotes, your comments lead back to those subjects. Quick review of what makes news. Reporters are looking for at least one of these things, if not two or three. I think they're always looking for something new, originality, something surprising, something that may be counterintuitive. We had a lot of success last year pitching the story about how Topeka, Kansas, in a red state, they were actually seeking to attract immigrants to their community. And that got tons of attention around the country because it was different and counterintuitive. And then I also think as economic development professionals and real estate professionals, we have access to a ton of data. Reporters love data. So anytime you can bring stats into your conversations or follow up with these statistics, as long as they're very recent, that can really help your credibility with the reporter and help the reporter out a lot.
I do think it's important when looking at these elements, you don't have to check all of these boxes. You don't have to have all of them, but you should have, when going out with the news, you should have at least one or two of these so it's appealing to the reporters. So we always try to work strategically with our clients to say, like, what makes this news stand out, and kind of making sure that we're checking the boxes to make it appealing to the reporters.
So, interview preparation, it's very important that you get inside the mind of a reporter before you speak to the reporter. And, our interest is very, very different than what a reporter's interests are in this conversation. So before you go into a conversation with a reporter, actually make sure you realize it is not a conversation. It is not a friendly sales pitch. It is your best efforts to tell your story in a clear, positive way. And they are going to try to catch you out and find out something very, very interesting and sexy that they can use for their story. So if you look at this list, your interests as the EDO or as the company are a positive story that will help you generate leads from investors, right? The reporter's interests are catchy headlines, a timely news story that maybe they get exclusively, and clicks, views, and revenue. So you're really at odds, and you should think about that before you go into any type of interview situation.
I think the tricky questions don't always come up, but it's always in your best interest to prepare for them in the case that they do. We've outlined on this slide some ones that we've seen over and over again. And I think two of the most common that I've seen, especially when joining interviews, is the loaded question. I feel like reporters tend to do this a lot, especially when they're digging into kind of a tougher topic. So they'll have within their question a negative or incorrect premise. So like, for example, if they were to ask, I've seen reports that a company in your CBD is moving to another city. Like, what are you doing to attract new companies? And in this case, you want to make sure that you're not commenting on the negative portion of the question because that could become your quote. Instead, you want to focus on the positives and your key messages to get a really strong quote that's in your favor. So you could respond with something like, we have a diverse range of companies from large corporations to innovative startups that have chosen our city as their home base. And extra points if you're able to even include a stat to kind of strengthen that even further. So in fact, we saw employment growth by 4.2, which is well above the national average. So that would become your quote as opposed to responding to the negative part of their question and then that becoming the focus. The other common one that comes up, I've seen quite a bit, especially we saw this leading up to the election, is the what if question. And this is when a reporter is asking you a hypothetical question. We also see this a lot with the economy. So they'll ask sometimes, is another recession looming or questions of that nature? And in these cases, unless you're an analyst or an economist, it's usually wise to use that as an opportunity to pivot to your key messages without commenting on a hypothetical. So usually what you could say is, I can't predict the future, but what I can tell you is, and then kind of shift to your agenda. We actually have two really strong examples that we could show you of what this looks like in practice. So I will shift to that next. This was an interview, just to give a little background. This was an interview we scheduled back in May with Bloomberg TV and radio for one of our clients with the NJEDA. And it's two examples where you could see a reporter asking a tough question, and this client was really effectively able to pivot to some of the key messages that he wanted to focus on. So the first one was that example of that loaded question where they were asking about pharma leaving New Jersey. He instead used it as an opportunity to pivot to some of his key messages. So I'll play this one next.
New Jersey has also been known, big time for the pharmaceutical industry, but I do feel like a reboot is kind of needed and necessary. Tell us how you see it. Give us the backdrop of what's been going on in terms of economic development in New Jersey and kind of what needs to be done and how you're hoping to change it.
Yeah, one of the big priorities for Governor Murphy is economic diversification. So, pharma and life sciences is still a huge calling card for us. We're home to a huge concentration of, global headquarters and U.S. headquarters for big multinational pharma companies. And we've seen a huge continued surge in that industry, but we want to diversify as well. So film and TV is a great example of that. The motion picture camera was invented by Thomas Edison in New Jersey. Fort Lee was Hollywood before there was Hollywood. We're trying to win it back, and we're not alone in that journey. So Netflix is committed to building a $1 billion production facility in Monmouth County at the old Fort Monmouth.
I really like how Tim was able to not only pivot to talk about the success of the pharma industry, but then talk about how New Jersey was where the motion picture was invented, and then talk about Netflix. So he managed to get kind of three main messages in a very short amount of time there.
And the second example that we'll show you was another tough question where it was leading up to a Trump rally, and it was more of a what if question that could have been very difficult to answer. But instead, in this case, he very smoothly shifted to some positive info, and I'll let you guys watch that one as well.
Is another worry for developers who faced high costs and supply chain woes. Former President Trump is going to hold a rally on the beach in Wildwood, New Jersey this weekend, a state that's become the front line for fights over the future of offshore wind.
Yeah, it'd be hard to argue that it'll be helpful to the wind industry. That being said, I think one of the things that we're encouraged by as we think about the future of offshore wind is the folks who are investing in offshore wind are actually the big global energy players. So we have a wind farm that's poised to start construction soon. That's backed. It's called Atlantic Shores. It's half owned by Shell. Right.
That was a really good pivot. Clearly there's a lot of controversy about the offshore wind industry, but Tim was prepared to talk about the investment by Shell, which is a big oil and gas company in offshore wind.
New Jersey has also been known, big time for the pharmaceutical.
So next slide, responding to tough questions. So this is something, again, you will want to practice these. And I think probably the best way to kind of learn how people respond to tough questions is by watching some of those Sunday morning shows, Meet the Press, Face the Nation. All the politicians there are so smooth. They get at something really, really tough, and then they're able to quickly pivot and talk about their agenda and their main 3 message points. So that's often a good kind of training ground for us as PR professionals. But make sure you write down your key messages before you go into that interview, and make sure it is your job to take what they ask you and then pivot back to what you want to say and have those solutions there.
I think in the last clip that we showed you, it was just a really good example of one of those key phrases where he was able to answer and he respectfully answered the question, but then said, that being said, and it bridged to what he actually wanted to discuss. So I think that is, like any of these key phrases that we have on the slide, I think it's really effective to pivot, but in a way that feels really natural and doesn't feel like you're deflecting. It feels like you're still having the conversation, but you're bringing it back to like what's most important.
Yeah, I also let me put this into perspective, or the bigger problem is, so if someone says, well, I heard this, headquarters has just left your community. Let me put that into perspective. We've actually attracted 5 new companies in the last 12 months that will add X amount of jobs to the community. So prepare for that. And big tip. I have had many clients that try to improvise when they don't know the answer to a question. I would advise that no one improvise in these situations. If you don't know the answer, it's very much okay to tell the reporter that you're going to get back to them with that information. You've got an economist on staff. You've got a research person that will pull that data, and you send it later. Do not speculate, because you could be quoted speculating on something and it could be embarrassing for you. So be very careful. A conversation with a reporter is not like a conversation with a prospect. And I think just the very last thing, sorry, on that last slide is make sure, again, that everything you say is on the record. So don't forget that.
This is actually one of my favorite tips that I love to share with clients. So I call it the magic question. I've been, just like April, I've been on hundreds of interviews, and I feel like 99% of the time, this is something that a reporter asks. So towards the end of the interview, when it's just about to wrap up, they usually want to make sure they covered it all. So they say, is there anything we didn't discuss or anything else I forgot to ask? And this is really your golden opportunity. You can either point back to one of your key messages that you already covered to re-emphasize it, or you can introduce another new key message that maybe you didn't have a chance to touch on that you think is really important. It's really the last piece of information that you leave that reporter with. So I always like to make sure that clients like make it count and not just tell the reporter like, nah, I think we covered it all. Like really use that to either reiterate a key point or introduce something new. And I think also in that moment, you could just offer to be a resource for that reporter for their upcoming coverage. I think a tiny gesture like that is just how like long-term relationships are built, and they continue to think of you for multiple articles.
So this is our last slide, key takeaways. So again, conversations with reporters are actually not conversations. These are not sales prospects that you want to spend hours and hours with, learning everything about their lives. You want to go in there clearly with your message points and get out of there relatively quickly. You want to speak in easy to understand terms, avoid jargon. I've had many clients go into interviews and they talk about their organization's name, you know, the KCADC did this, and we're working with the EDC of KC and, you know, these groups. And, you know, a national reporter doesn't know these acronyms. And so you want to approach the interview as if you're talking with someone that you might meet on the elevator or in a networking group. The other really important thing I want to emphasize here is do not talk too much in these interviews. Stop. Allow the reporter to take notes if they're taking notes, and then think about what their next question will be for you. You don't want to just be selling and overwhelm the reporter so much that a reporter, I've seen reporters leave interviews and they have almost too much information, but not any of the information that they wanted. And they don't write a story, and they don't reach back out to you either for commentary later. So you want to be helpful and understand what their needs are in those situations.
And I think in terms of the don'ts, a lot of these are pretty common sense, but I think a few that stand out to me the most are just not telling jokes, because you never know how those are going to translate or if they're going to make the reporter uncomfortable and kind of change the whole vibe. Don't speak too quickly. I feel like that's a pretty common one where if you know you're going into it, you're a bit nervous, you speak faster. And just also kind of segueing off of what April was just talking about, not over answering. So pauses and silence are totally okay in the context of an interview. You want to give the reporter a moment to process what you just said. And I think it allows for a more natural back and forth as opposed to them almost like having difficulty getting a word in edgewise. So always like think about pausing, and it also gives you a moment to think about what you kind of want to respond on next.
Yeah, and I think sometimes the reason why spokespeople tend to talk too much or too long is that they feel like the silence is awkward. But in reality, again, this is not a social interaction or even a regular business interaction. It's an interview. So it's okay if it feels a little bit awkward. And sometimes reporters actually use that silence to try to get you to say too much. So it can be a tactic. They're not necessarily going to try to make you feel comfortable, but you don't need to make them feel comfortable either. Your goal is to get your messages out and get a favorable story about your organization, your community, your company.